Good evening, everyone. We are at our 80th video. Welcome, dear Ümit.
Thank you. Greetings, dear friends.
Yes, last month, we read the passages about the ending of this world cycle in tumultuous and cataclysmic disasters. This evening, we will read passages about the mechanism of this phase, about what causes such drastic results and how. That is, we will read about the sojourner planet that is getting closer to our solar system.
Yes, in this series, whenever I joined you in the previous months, our lot was the passages about death. This time, we will bring the end of the world together.
Actually, the knowledge about the closing of the world cycles that happened many times in this world school is not new, but via which mechanism the world cycles ends and opens had never been explained in such a clear way so far. Because of this, the divine order and the universe gives us indeed a bridge knowledge. As we read and learn, we understand the purpose and aim of the processes the being go through via the explanations and descriptions in this book. So far, I have never met such a knowledge that openly explains the material physical dimensions of the knowledge given in the ancient and occult teaching that have mostly heavily veiled so far. This book is not symbolic. We even find the explanations and descriptions of the mechanisms behind the well-known symbols. As I just mentioned, last month, we read the passages about the ending of this world cycle in tumultuous and cataclysmic disasters none of us want to experience. But also, we learnt that such scary apocalyptic scenes are a necessary mechanism in the closing of this world cycle, and in the developmental progress of the human being and the essence being. As we frequently say, from the perspective of the being, there is no good or bad, pacifying or scary. There is only experience for the being. So please, let's try to watch or read these parts of this book, by moving beyond such fears and concerns. After all, what scares us are already happening. We are afraid of death, still we die. We are afraid of the unknown and we want to know future. Still, when the naked truth of the near future is in the open, we reject the idea. We try turning a blind eye to the harsh possibilities on the horizon. In that sense, our psyche is full of contradictions. This is the human condition. We are a duality unit by nature, and always under the bombardment of influences from all kinds of levels. And when the ongoing processing of impressions from life gets hard, we tend to favor repeated, known, familiar experiences, instead of processing ever-renewing ones, and this defense mechanism keeps us in a deep and unaware sleep of automatic reactions, responses, actions, thinking and behaving within and without, and life events, designed by the influences of the mechanism of destiny, the cadres of beings in duty, our guiding beings and our essence being bring annoying, shaking, sublimating lessons all the time so we can wake up and stand up to move toward widening our comprehension. Yes, let's start reading. Now, we give the necessary explanation about the technical mechanism which supports the knowledge we gave above about the sinking of the world. Before we engage this explanation, we will revisit a scientific subject we have previously mentioned. Each of the billions of systems filling the nebulae is constituted by a nucleus which is called the Sun, and the planets revolving around it, that is, the matter parts of that system. We had previously said that within such a system, each sphere has its own particular magnetic field. Likewise, we had explained that although these fields, which are in distinct characters particular to the matter part they are subject to, are in close communication with each other within a system, they never mingle with each other, and thus, any matter part which belongs to a sphere cannot leave the magnetic field of that sphere and enter the magnetic field of another sphere, and in case such a state occurs in the face of an enforcement, it is imperative for that object to adapt the quality of the new magnetic field it entered, and in order to do this it has to change its own quality mandatorily. So, consequently, various magnetic fields of various spheres within a system interact in accordance with the necessities of the general structure of that system, and are in a state of complete equilibrium. Forms, lengths, shortness, axial directions of the orbits of the matter parts, that is, spheres and the nucleus within the system, the velocities of the planet's axial rotation and of their orbital periods are appointed by the states of motions which will occur in consequence of the development of that system and the states of equilibrium among them, and these motions are possible by interactions among the parts and under the control of the higher influences. All of these, as we said, depend on the developmental and evolutionary degrees of the systems, and they change in accordance with these degrees. That is, the occurrence of the influences between the matter parts of a system, in forms to put into effect the motions in this or that way, vary in accordance with the states pertaining to the evolution of that system. In short, there are various matter parts rotating around a nucleus. Each of these matter parts has its own magnetic field. According to the developmental degrees of that nucleus and the parts which rotate around it, the states of interactions between these magnetic fields vary. So, the whole of the states of equilibrium which is established as a result of these interactions puts into effect a magnetic field synthesis, and we call this the solar system. Therefore, each system has a state which contains a complex magnetic field synthesis, and this is particular only to that system. Consequently, it is necessary for it to be in a state of equilibrium with the magnetic fields of other systems as well, and this equilibrium of magnetic field extends as it gets complex and widened into the nebulae in between. Therefore, between the magnetic field complexes of a nebula, there are also encompassing states of equilibrium accordingly.
We see in that passage that the book revisits the fundamental knowledge about matter. Because if we talk about the ending of a cycle, of a world cycle, a mechanism exists that rendering this process, and this process depends on some intra-universe principles and mechanisms as well. That is, it occurs through and via this basic or main knowledge of matter and its mechanisms. Yes, through our sense organs we can feel, sense, perceive, and observe natural events. Let's say, strong winds, an earthquake, a volcano's eruption, etc. But most of the humans don't know that these can occur only via the interactions of magnetic fields of the beings. Yet we know because at the earlier pages, we already read and discussed that beings utilize matter and matter combinations via their magnetic fields. Do you remember Matrix the movie, where every action is actually green codes, getting written and working all the time at the background of everything that happens? I mean, if we could take on special glasses and look at the whole universe, I think we would see the simultaneous, instantaneous, continuous interactions and exchanges of the magnetic fields of every tangible and intangible beings and objects. I mean, the invisible canvas of the universe on everything that can be perceived by the beings in accordance with their levels of comprehensions is entirely this exchange and interaction of magnetic fields. And as we begin to read this and following passages, it becomes obvious why the plan started this book by giving us the fundamental basic knowledge of matter, of the duality principle, of the value differentiation, the emergence of initial atoms and of the occurrence of the initial hydrogen atom, magnetic fields, the interactions between these, etc. Because this was not about the technical side of things. No, it is because these constitute the background of the all that is, the entire existence. Each of us is a magnetic field synthesis. The magnetic fields of each subatomic particles, atoms, molecule, cells, tissues, organs, etc. make up our magnetic field synthesis. Similarly, this applies to all celestial objects as well. They are living beings, and each has its own magnetic field synthesis. In those earlier passages, we had read how the individual magnetic fields of the particles emerge but never merge with each other, as their combinations expand into atoms and molecules, etc., but coexist as a synthesis in harmony and balance. So, this also applies to our Sun. In this passage, we read about the forms, lengths, shortness, axial directions of the orbits, velocities of the planet's axial rotation, and of their orbital periods are mentioned. And yes, these may sound technical, but again, in the earlier passages, we had read the explanation about the filter mechanisms around our planet that keeps its equilibrium, and then, this explanation was beneficial in understanding the following passages. Something is very certain for me. When we leave our physical bodies in this world and pass to the higher plans after our graduation from this world school, everything that looks and sounds now technical or intense to us will become so simple to us. Because the whole universe is technical in that sense, even behind a seemingly insignificant encounter, this immense and magnificent technical aspect of the existence is active. But of course, right now, at our current level of comprehension, it is impossible for us to comprehend the causality at those higher levels. Yet, one thing is sure, starting from the objects we can hold and touch, our body included, to the celestial objects, galaxies, galaxy clusters, all of these are in interaction via their magnetic fields. No matter how greater the picture in our mind becomes, the only difference is the number of the magnetic fields in a synthesis. And the resultant complexity, the increasing charge of the influences, widening in scope, of the being, of the object. When seen from this perspective, in case we find those initial concepts at the earlier passages of this book hard to understand, we can apply this scaled-down, scale-up projections as a method.
I am sure all of us know that well-known and simple image of an atom, a nucleus in the center, and electrons revolving around it. The smallest model of the same mechanism. Of course, the models are just representations, still they provide us with a simple map, allowing us to imagine, visualize, and understand. We are now so familiar with magnetic fields, even though we don't know that they are magnetic fields. We go to hospital for a magnetic resonance imaging, we call each other on our mobiles via Wi-Fi. When there are coronal mass ejections from our sun, they affect the magnetic fields around our communication satellites and electric power arrays, and as you mentioned, there is a magnetic shield around our planet, our magnetosphere, protecting us from harmful radiations of the sun. In short, magnetic fields are now familiar concepts, and in the current point our scientific knowledge and technology, we can easily measure and detect those fields. Hence, once invisible magnetic fields are now more concrete to our minds. As we discover more of the microcosmos, we also realize macrocosmos. Yes, everything is just a magnetic field synthesis. Everything has a measurable and detectable structure. And we read in this passage that each system is a whole in itself. Although individual magnetic fields are in close communication with each other within a system, they never mingle with each other. Yet, if a new magnetic field, as an enforcement, affects a sphere's magnetic field, that new object has to adapt the quality of the new magnetic field it entered, and it has to change its own quality mandatorily. Soon, we will read more about this. Actually, in the collective unconscious of the humanity, we encounter the examples of such mandatory changes. The most well-known is the theory of a devastating asteroid impact perishing all dinosaurs. Even now, we sometimes hear about the asteroids flying near our planet or our moon. In the legends and teachings of ancient cultures, celestial bodies hitting our planet were mentioned. And also, in our science fiction movies and novels, we encounter similar plots. So, we read in this passage the mechanism of the changes and encounters of those magnetic fields that our planet had gone and will go through.
And that state a state of complete equilibrium among planets of our solar system, and also outer celestial objects like in the Kuiper Belt and even all other objects in the Milky Way galaxy. Each is a component in the general or greater equilibrium. And we understand that this state is sustained, and soon we will read what happens if it gets disrupted.
This is how the divine order and the universe explains things. First, as an introductory knowledge, then as detailed descriptions. First, we read what will happen to our planet during the closing period of this world cycle. Now we read about the general mechanism ensuring the interactions and equilibrium among the magnetic fields of spheres. Of course, all of this happens in our universe, our hydrogen cosmos.
Yes, we need to underline this fact again. What is defined as universe by science today is defined as the hydrogen cosmos in this book.
Yes. Let's continue reading. Changes to occur in any sphere which is included in a system are possible by the influences to be sent to the magnetic field of that sphere. That is, infinite changes needed in a sphere occur through influences to arrive at the magnetic field of that sphere from the sun of the system, or from elsewhere, and these influences are sent directly or indirectly by the beings of the plan of duty who are engaged in that system. If changes in scale of a great revolution are needed upon any sphere, as the ones in the world we have mentioned above, then the need of sending more intense and forceful influences arises. Therefore, let us explain where this strong influence, which will put into effect this great world revolution that will evidently take place, comes from and how it renders its function. The first strong influence which will reach the solar system for this event will come from the magnetic field of a planet, which is almost 400 times that of the Earth, of another system which is at great distances from this system. This planet, while larger than the Earth, which has much simpler and heavy matter than the world, has an accustomed orbit it follows around its own sun, which is quite distant from the solar system. And as it traverses its orbit, it has diverted from the part of its orbit which coincides with the solar system, which the Earth is subject to, and started to advance towards the solar system by making a vast curve. This situation has been realized through the influences continuously sent by a plan, in accordance with the directives coming from the unitary, engaged with the large and small revolutions to occur in many systems pertaining to this advance. Consequently, upon its great curve, this planet will reach a certain point which is plotted for it by that sublime plan of duty, close to the solar system, and later it will change the direction of its advance, that is, its curve back to its own system, and when entering the original orbit of its system, it will continue its accustomed orbit around its own sun. This planet's diverting from its accustomed orbit and extending its journey in an unusual way with a great semi-curving towards the close quarters of the solar system, whilst returning back after a certain point without colliding with the sun, is of course not a coincidental event, but is a result of a sublime necessity coming from the unitary. This planet has currently left its orbit and advances towards the direction of the solar system and gets nearer at each moment. This planet, which is still impossible to observe right now, will be observable with the naked eye from the Earth 150 to 200 years later. Now, let us elaborate on the consequences of this planet's unusual journey.
Here, we read about a planet which is in its own solar system, but please notice. There are two different systems. Each sphere, that is, our planet and the sojourner planet, have an organization of duty of their own, and, respectively, the solar system of each has its own organization of duty, etc. And between all those levels or plans of duty, the exchange among these is intricately complex. Of course, we always talk about the resultant events of this exchange pertaining to our world, but this sojourner sphere also will return to its solar system by assuming new values. Of course, all the seemingly disastrous effects of its magnetic field over the magnetic field of our world, the resultant axial shift of our planet, etc., that planet will gain some values. Because no matter how many times it is bigger than our planet, it is cruder in comparison, and inevitably, due to the value differentiation, it will gain values as it continues its rouge orbit. Yet, this encounter of the magnetic fields of these two planets will result in destructive events for all living beings in the world. And when we read about how this sojourner planet leaves its usual orbit and eventually gets closer to our solar system, and after a certain point of this rouge orbit, how it returns to its own system, we feel wonder and awe in the face of the might and force of the plans of duty which, when necessary, make celestial objects change their usual course in order to utilize its magnetic field, its disruptive effects over another planet's magnetic field, and later, to make this planet go back to its usual orbit. If our dear friends remember, in the earlier pages of this book, we had read that a human being's governance over its body and an organization of duties, governance over a solar system, are actually similar in the sense of mechanism. The only difference between these is the complexity, the width of their respective scope, capacity, and agency. And, I think, we can deduct from this passage what kind of experiences a being will be having as it continues to get developed and becomes more able to utilize matter combinations. And for our dear friends asking about where this sojourner planet is now, please take notice that different scientific disciplines are in search of a celestial body that must be big enough to account for the slight changes in the orbits of asteroids and comets in the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud, and also some changes in the atmospheric observations pertaining the planets of our solar system. But most importantly, pertaining the factors playing a role in the climate changes in our planet. There are many astronomers working to find out this so far elusive ninth planet by measuring and observing the changes in the magnetic fields of the planets and on the orbits of the asteroids and comets. I think, in the near future, they will have more discernible measurements because the effects of that planet's magnetic field over our planet's magnetic field will be more obvious. And after a certain point, we will be observing this effect directly, let's say, on the shift of the poles, hence the displacement of our planet's magnetic field. Yes, these passages have a prophetic quality. Back in those years, when Mr. Ruhselman received these spiritual communiqués and compiled the knowledge into this book, global warming or greenhouse gases, hole in the ozone layer, etc. were not a part of our everyday conversations. Yet we read about this sojourner planet and its effects over our planet, in the divine order in the universe.
Well, I think, as those so-called prophecies gets proven true one by one, people may take the knowledge given in the rest of this book more seriously. Let's continue reading. This journey of the planet we mentioned is the necessity of a general evolutionary process which concern many systems. Firstly, this planet itself will encounter and collide with the magnetic fields of many other systems, until it gets closer to the solar system. With each collision, enormous tremors, instabilities and upheavals will occur on its own structure, and the beings of that planet, which are much simpler and primitive compared to that of our world, will only be able to accelerate their development by means of those enormous convulsions. Secondly, this planet will cause disruptions in varying degrees in the equilibrium of the many other systems it will encounter. Until it reaches the solar system, it will make their states topsy-turvy, and consequently, it will prepare possibilities for the development of many other spheres. Finally, its magnetic field will influence our solar system in the way we will soon explain, and our Earth, which is the most developed sphere of this system, will get into most violent consequences of this influence. Now, we begin to explain the working mechanism of the influences which cause the emergence of these consequences.
When we read this passage, we understand that this sojourner planet will not become an additional planet in our solar system. No, its approach and its magnetic field will cause the effects detailed in the previous passages of the book, and we will read more about them soon. This planet will continue its travel until it returns to its own solar system. And of course, as it now travels toward our solar system, it will encounter the magnetic fields of many other spheres, and it will disrupt their equilibrium, as well as its own by the mechanism of value differentiation, and many structural upheavals will happen on its surface as well. Still, because it is a cruder sphere, and because our planet is the most evolved sphere in our solar system, this exchange between magnetic fields will cause the most devastating effects in our planet Earth. As we learnt in the earlier passages, within a magnetic field synthesis, if a part of this synthesis becomes differentiated in value, then the rest of the other parts in relation to it has to go through some changes. So, in a cascading effect, many events will occur in the closing period of this world cycle, due to the effect of this sojourner planet over the magnetic field synthesis of all related spheres and beings in our solar system.
We read in this passage that there is a life form on this sojourner planet, as well, hence, a system ensuring the development of those beings on that planet. And as their planet deorbits, this huge differentiation in its magnetic field causes enormous tremors on its structure, and as it travels, the influence exchange increases, with each collision of its magnetic field with the magnetic fields of other spheres, So, the system of those beings on this planet also gets developed. And when this sojourner planet eventually approaches closer to our solar system, the collision of the magnetic fields and all those mandatory changes in the magnetic field synthesis will create havoc in and on our planet, and consequently, will lead the mass transition of humankind to the plan of love. So, it is like executing 3 different duties through one planet's deorbiting.
And also, because of those changes it goes through during its rouge travel due to value differentiation and exchange of influences, when it goes back to its own solar system, then the chain reaction of new events will begin.
In the previous passage, we read that this planet will be observable with the naked eye from the Earth 150 to 200 years later. If we take into account that Mr. Ruhselman received these spiritual communiqués between 1958 and 1959, let's say 1960, so, almost 72 years have already passed. Therefore, around 70 years later, it will be visible to the naked eye. Still, interestingly, astronomers and researchers already detected the effects of a so far invisible celestial body over the many planet bodies in our vicinity in the Milky Way and over our solar system. So, after all those years, and gradually increasing effects of this sojourner planet over the magnetic field of our planet, the culmination point of those effects will be those last days of the world as we know it, and then a new world cycle will begin. It looks like we don't have much time. I mean, what's 70 or 100 or 150 years in the whole human history?
And what will be the state of those eyes that can see that planet in the skies? I think, considering the chronology stated in the book, those will be the beings that survive those cataclysms. And also, what we see in the skies and in the space, due to the speed of light and the distance between us and those celestial objects, we can only see their past versions. So, until we can see its image, its magnetic field will cause all those devastations.
Yes, you are right. Let's continue reading. Earth does not rotate on its orbit around the Sun in a vertical axis. This axis is tilted at 23 degrees 27 feet to the vertical position, and it completes its daily cycles by rotating around this direction. At certain places of the world, which rotates under these conditions, for example, at its poles, there are the located and continuous icy regions, and between the poles, an established equatorial climate. The top and bottom points of this axis, assumed in the direction of this tilt, constitute the south and north poles of the world. That is, the points where these poles exist correspond to the 2 end points of the axis the world rotates on. As the world rotates around its own axis, the motions it makes are 0 at these points. And this is a result of the state of the general equilibrium that is established within the whole of the world, through innumerable imbalances occurred through the value differentiation of the magnetic field values in opposing characters, which are constituted by the world parts in accordance with the duality principle we previously mentioned. Today, this equilibrium, despite it registering more or less slight deviations, is in a stable state. As a result of this situation, the current geographical climates, seasons and states of day and night are brought about. Now, let us trace the planet which gets near to the solar system. Currently, this planet is at a very great distance from the solar system. Consequently, its magnetic field is not yet in direct contact with the magnetic field of the solar system. However, from the moment this planet, which is 400 times the size of the Earth, has left its orbit and started to advance towards the solar system, some indirect influences of it have started to affect the solar system. That is, the magnetic field of our solar system, which is in relation with the magnetic fields of other systems, which this planet is now in contact, receives the influences of the aforesaid planet through this way. However, because this planet is still very far away, and its influences arrive through ways involving the intermediaries, its consequences in the solar system are very weak today. Nevertheless, this planet continuously gets closer to the Sun. A moment will come, almost 50 or 60 years later from today, that the magnetic field of this planet will enter a state of direct contact with the magnetic field of the solar system. When this state occurs, the very heavy and dense magnetic field of the planet will make a powerfully oppressing influence over the magnetic field of the Sun. This heavy influence the whole solar system with all its planets receives will put into effect various reactions upon the planets, more correctly, upon their magnetic fields. We said that the influence coming from the sojourner planet is very coarse and heavy. Therefore, because there is an enormous incompatibility between the subtle and complex magnetic field of the Earth, which is the most evolved sphere of the solar system, and the coarse magnetic field of this planet, the most violently convulsive consequences and reactions of the influence coming from the planet to the solar system will be seen in the Earth sphere. As a result of this situation, the Earth's current stable axial tilt of 23 degrees 27 feet will increase 13 degrees under the pressure of this coarse magnetic field of the planet, and the axis of the world will be tilted at 36 degrees to its orbital plane. The initial shift of the poles begins with the sojourner planet's first direct influences to arrive at the solar system. The concept of pressure here should not be taken literally, that is, it should not be thought here as if the world is impacted or bent with a push coming from outside. To explain this, let us first take the motions of a sphere which rotates around its own axis. This sphere rotates around a straight line called axis, which connects the two stable points we call the poles. The occurrence of the polar points here is the result of the sum of the total equilibria, put into effect by the opposite values in the structure of the sphere and its magnetic field, that is, by the motions. Motions at the poles are zero. On the other hand, where the motions are most is the belt region, which is the exact middle of the distance between two poles which we call the equator. So, the mean ratio between the velocities of the motion, which is the most in the equator and is the least at the poles, is the resultant manifestation of the total sum of the motion equilibria in the sphere, as we said. Therefore, when disruption or alteration occurs in these equilibria within the sphere for any reason, then the 0 points, in other words, polar points, can be displaced. That is, poles can shift slightly or radically, depending on the intensity of the degree of the equilibrium change, upon the sphere to the back or forth, left or right relative to their former locations. And in accordance with the equilibrium principle, the equator immediately changes its position, takes its proper place around the sphere relative to the new poles. Occurrence of this situation means that the sphere which rotates starts to divert from the former rotational direction in order to rotate in a different direction on the axis which occurred between the new poles. Let's pause here and discuss what we read so far, because this is a long passage.
We know, and also read here, that Earth rotates on its orbit around the Sun in a tilted axis at 23 degrees 27 feet to the vertical position, and as our planet rotates around its own axis, the motions it makes are zero at the north and south poles. And this state of our planet is the result of the state of the general equilibrium among all magnetic fields of all beings that make up our world. So, this is our current and balanced state of our planet. However, this equilibrium has already begun to be disrupted, and we read that it is because of the incompatibility between the magnetic field of the sojourner planet and the magnetic field of our planet, or more correctly, our solar system. And due to the chains of events, our planet's current stable axial tilt will increase under the indirect pressure from the sojourner planet's coarse magnetic field. Eventually, axis of our planet will be tilted at 36 degrees to its orbital plane. Consequently, pole points, equator line, etc. will need to change place over the globe. And as we read here, these indirect effects of the sojourner planet's magnetic field are already detected on the gradual shifting of the magnetic poles of our planet. Previously, GPS gadgets had to be recalibrated every 5 years, but now they need more frequent calibrations in order to keep up with the increasingly faster shift of the magnetic pole. And in this passage, we read a detailed list of locations the poles shift towards to. And when we think of the resultant melting of the glaciers and ice caps of the poles, and the resultant tectonic shifts, and the resultant changes in the cold and warm oceanic currents, and the resultant changes in pressure, and the resultant hurricanes and megastorms. In short, these are some of the multi-directional reactions that will occur in our world. to those indirect effects of the magnetic field of the sojourner planet. And here, we read that almost 50 or 60 years later from today, the magnetic field of this planet will enter a state of direct contact with the magnetic field of the solar system. When this state occurs, the very heavy and dense magnetic field of the planet will make a powerfully oppressing influence over the magnetic field of the Sun. So, it is happening now, and this may explain the current observations of the unexpected coronal behaviors of our star, the Sun.
And let's not forget that this shifting of magnetic poles had happened many times in the lifetime of our planet, so this will not happen for the first time. Science discovered many findings supporting such shifts, both magnetically and also geographically. Yes. Let's continue reading the rest of this passage. And the thing that will happen in the Earth is the same. After the influences coming from the outside planet to the magnetic field of the Earth and in turn, into its structure, disrupt the initial equilibrium by affecting the inner motions of the sphere, these changes in the equilibrium continue on through new states and new motions that start to occur in the Earth, in accordance with the consecutive value differentiation mechanism, up to the boundary where the equilibrium is to be established completely. As the result of this, the existing north and south poles at the known locations of the Earth shift. Since the poles, as we just mentioned, are the result of the general equilibrium of the sphere, as these are displaced, the equator of the sphere immediately changes its place to take its required location on the surface of the sphere, according to the new situations of the poles. Therefore, the axial direction between the sphere's new poles to occur will start to change after the shifted positions of the poles relative to its former axial direction. For example, as the Earth's north pole starts to shift gradually towards the south at the part in Siberia, the south pole will start to shift towards the north within the same degrees at the opposite part, at the direction where the Cape of South America is located. As the result of this, equator will take its place around the Earth at same distance from these two new poles, that is, its location will change relative to the poles. In this case, because the Earth always rotates around its own axis between the poles, and this axis is more tilted than the former one, this situation of the Earth displays the scenery which is a little bit more tilted relative to the former one. Actually, the Earth sphere has not changed its position. For example, Francis Joseph's land will be at the same place where it has been in a tilted line relative to the orbit of the Earth. However, the polar point which has been there will now be located not there but much lower relative to this archipelago. Similarly, Taimyr Peninsula will also not move an inch from its former locations relative to the Earth's orbit. However, the former North Pole is above it, but the new North Pole will go partly below this peninsula and will occur below it. Similarly, in the southern hemisphere the South Pole is to be arranged according to it. For example, the South Pole, which previously has been at much lower parts of Alexander Island, although this island would not change its place relative to the Earth's orbit, has now shifted to its higher part. So, the direction of the new axis of the Earth, which occurs relative to its new poles, has become slightly more tilted to its former equator relative to its former axis, and the new equator has changed accordingly and moved up to a surface vertical to the newly occurred axis. Thus, as a consequence of the disruption of the total motion equilibrium of the world by the influence coming from the planet, the North Pole will shift south at the Russia side, and the South Pole will move up north at the direction of the Cape of the South America. Certainly, in accordance with this situation, the oblique degree of the axis between the newly situated North and South Poles, relative to the former axis of the Earth, will increase relative to the obliquity degree of the former axis, and this increase will be at an angle of 13 degrees. The locations of these points, in accordance with the current geographical positions are, the new North Pole will shift to a point where the current polar circle joins with the 100th meridian, and the South Pole will rise up in the direction of the Cape of the South America and reach the point where the current South Polar Circle joins with the 80th meridian. Naturally, then all meridians and parallels as well as the equator will shift, and they will take their places upon the Earth, according to the new poles.
Wish we had a globe, so we could point the new locations of poles on it, and maybe tilt it a little bit more.
There are simulations on the internet they try different tilt angles and try to predict what kind of a climate our world we can have under related conditions. Briefly, the authors of one of the articles write, higher axis tilt means warmer poles relative to the equator on average, but stronger seasons, even at the equator. So, the resultant axis tilt at 36 degrees, as stated in this passage, means a hostile climate. Yes, let's check the questions in the chat box. Some of our dear friends asks if this sojourner planet is the planet Marduk, or the 12th planet in the Sumerian legends.
Some people will say Planet X, some will say Marduk, some will say 9th planet. And I am sure when it gets closer, people will give this planet many more names. Yet, these names given to some rogue planets in the ancient cultures may be imprinted in collective unconscious of humankind. But we don't know if these are same or different. What we know is that this end, this closing of our current world cycle through this chain of events, is now destined. So we will live and experience it as the humankind.
There are many questions, and I can summarize them as one question. What is the purpose of Plan of Duty by deorbiting this planet and set it on a rogue route to affect the spheres it encounters? We had mentioned that this sojourner planet is a coarse and backward system in comparison with our planet. So, it means that developmental system of the living beings on this planet will go through a deformation, formation and transformation process due to the enormous tremors on its structure caused by this deorbiting of the sojourner planet. In this way, the development of the beings that utilize the magnetic field synthesis of those living beings, and of course, of their spirits. This is the first purpose. And the second is, as this rogue travels toward our solar system, it will encounter other spheres, celestial bodies, space dust, etc., and by exchanging influences with the magnetic fields of all bodies it encounters, the influence exchange increases. And with each collision of its magnetic field with the magnetic fields of other spheres, the matter systems and/or matter combinations in their structures and bodies will be destructed and restructured. In this way, the development of the beings governing such bodies also will get developed. And the third one is closely about us. And when this sojourner planet's magnetic field synthesis collides with the magnetic field of our sun and of our planet, all those mandatory changes in the magnetic field synthesis will create havoc in and on our planet, and as a consequence, this current term of the world school will be closed down, and a great majority of the humankind will pass to the plan of love by releasing their hold on their physical bodies rather more easily because of those period of natural disasters and increasing harshness of world life. People will be understanding that world matter does not contain any more possibilities for them. So, the mass transition of humankind to the plan of love will be facilitated. Yes, let me wish you a good evening and a good week, hoping to see you all next week.
Good evening, dear friends.